This is a homily for the 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 35, verses 4 to 7. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 7, verses 31 to 37. We are still with Jesus during his ministry in the region of Galilee, although today's Gospel is set in Gentile territory on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Immediately before today's Gospel story about Jesus healing a deaf mute, Mark tells us that Jesus had set out and gone to the region of Tyre. There he healed the daughter of a Syro-Phoenician woman. As you can see from the map, Tyre is to the north of Galilee. It was an ancient Phoenician city with a large mixed population. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that the inhabitants of Tyre were bitter enemies of the Jews. But the Galileans also resented the people of Tyre, partly because much of the agricultural produce of Jewish Galilee ended up in Gentile Tyre, often leaving Jewish peasants hungry. So Jesus enters territory that is not only Gentile, but also potentially hostile. Today's Gospel begins by telling us that Jesus returned from the region of Tyre, going by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. As you can see from the map, Sidon is about 35 kilometres north of Tyre. Mark doesn't tell us why Jesus went to Sidon and what, if anything, he did there. Jesus then turns southwards to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. The word Decapolis comes from the Greek and it means 10 towns. It was a federation of 10 Hellenistic cities, and that's how it got the name. The region of the Decapolis was predominantly Gentile. As you can see here, the only area where the Sea of Galilee borders the region of the Decapolis is to the southeast of the sea. Again, Jesus is in Gentile territory, and his ministry in Tyre and here may well be foreshadowing the eventual movement of the gospel to the Gentiles. A deaf mute is brought to Jesus. The Greek word used here is kophos, the original meaning of which was blunted or dulled. Deafness, by way of analogy, occurs when one's tongue is blunted or dulled. The word means completely unable to hear. In an oral culture such as this one, those who cannot hear are at a great disadvantage. They are marginalised in ways that others are not. The other Greek word used here is moglilalos, which means literally speaking with difficulty. That describes accurately the predicament of those who are born deaf. It is extremely difficult to pronounce words correctly if you are unable to hear them. Mark's use of this word immediately raises a red flag. The lectionary comes to our assistance here because Mark's use of moglilalos is almost certainly an allusion to the passage chosen for our first reading today from the prophet Isaiah. Through the prophet Isaiah, God addresses his people. Be strong, do not be afraid. Here is your God, vengeance is coming, divine retribution. He is coming to save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unsealed. The word used for deaf in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, is mogilalos. This is the only time that this word appears in the entire Septuagint. These words of the prophet Isaiah are addressed to the exiles in Babylon in the 6th century BC. Through the prophet Isaiah, God assures his people that he is coming to save them. Normally, those travelling from Babylonia to the land of Israel would set out in a northwesterly direction along the river Euphrates, then southwest through Syria. That route is marked in red on the map, and as you can see, it avoids the route that went directly west through the impassable desert. The prophecy of Isaiah insists that the exiles will be able to travel directly and quickly through the desert. The coming of God will have marvellous transforming effects for both humanity and the natural world. The return to Zion is portrayed as a new exodus. Like the Israelites fleeing slavery in Egypt, the returning exiles will receive water and protection in the desert as they go. So what are we to make of the echoes of Isaiah chapter 35 that we find in Mark chapter 7 verse 37? Notice that I've used the word echoes. Unlike Matthew, Mark rarely points explicitly to correspondences between Israel's scripture and the story of Jesus. In Matthew's Gospel, we hear almost a dozen times something like, "All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet." Mark, however, leaves his readers to make the connections for themselves. New Testament scholar Richard Hayes explains the echo of Isaiah in today's Gospel. This echo hints that Jesus' activity is a sign of the fulfillment of Isaiah's promise. Mark's allusion to Isaiah intimates that in Jesus' wonder-working activity, the new creation envisaged by Isaiah is now breaking in, and that the return from exile is underway. The link between Mark chapter 7 verse 37 and Isaiah chapter 35 carries one further implication, however, that has been less often recognised. We should not overlook the fact that the agent of the healing and restoring action in Isaiah chapter 35 is none other than God himself. As you can see, the verse that immediately precedes Isaiah's reference to healing the deaf makes the point forcefully. Here is your God. He is coming to save you. So Mark is offering us a provocative hint that Jesus is more than a prophet or a wonder worker or an intermediary figure announcing God's salvation. The one who makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak is, according to Isaiah, the Lord God, who comes with might to bring redemption to Israel. This brings us back to an important point that I made during the 5 weeks that we reflected upon chapter 6 of John's Gospel. Although we would call the healing of a deaf man, recorded in today's Gospel, a miracle, the Gospels never use the actual word miracle. They prefer words such as dunamis, which means a work of power. It's the Greek word from which we get our English word dynamite. Then we have the Greek word teras, which can be translated as wonder or marvel. And then we have semeon, which means sign. When we call the miracles signs, it's a way of saying that the reality to which they are pointing is this: the God who is transcendent, eternal, invisible, and almighty has become immanent, temporal, visible, and vulnerable in the ministry of Jesus. What New Testament scholar Gail O'Day says about the use of sign in John's Gospel is equally applicable to the Synoptic Gospels as well. John uses the term sign to refer to Jesus' miracles because, for John, the significance of the miracle does not rest solely in the act of the miracle itself, but in that to which the miracle points. That is, the deed reveals the doer and points to the significance of the deed. The healing of a deaf man in today's Gospel is one of the few examples where the evangelist includes the actual Aramaic word that Jesus used, Ephphatha, be opened. Jesus speaks a word of power that frees the man from his infirmity. The only other healing miracle in which Jesus' words are rendered in Aramaic is the story about Jesus raising the young girl who has died. He says to her, Talitha cum, little lamb, arise. Mark probably retains the Aramaic here because of the popular belief in the power of Jesus' original words. The baptismal liturgy of the Catholic Church includes the rite of Ephphatha. The celebrant touches the ears and the mouth of the child with his thumb, saying, "The Lord Jesus made the deaf hear and the dumb speak. May he soon touch your ears to receive his word and your mouth to proclaim his faith, to the praise and glory of God the Father." Healing a deaf man is a miracle. But let's pause for a moment to ask the question, what is a miracle? None of Jesus' contemporaries denied that he performed miracles. His opponents didn't deny that he performed miracles, they simply attributed his power to the evil one and not to God. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus acknowledged that Jesus was a miracle worker. He calls Jesus a wise man who worked startling deeds. So, what is a miracle? The American biblical scholar John Mayer has written a 5-volume study on Jesus and the Gospels entitled A Marginal Jew. The second volume of this study deals with the miracles of Jesus. Mayer offers this working definition of a miracle. A miracle is an unusual, startling, or extraordinary event that is, in principle, perceivable by any interested and fair-minded observer. So, praying for a parking space and finding one against all the odds doesn't really fit this definition of a miracle. Secondly, it is an event that finds no reasonable explanation in human abilities or in other known forces that operate in our world of time and space. And thirdly, it is an event that is the result of a special act of God, doing what no human power can do. At this point, it's worth considering an observation made by John Polkinghorne. Before being ordained as an Anglican priest in 1982, John had been Professor of Mathematical Physics at the University of Cambridge from 1968 to 1979. Speaking about miracles, he says this: "Science simply tells us that these events are against normal expectation. We knew this at the start. Science cannot exclude the possibility that on particular occasions God does particular unprecedented things. After all, God is the ordainer of the laws of nature, not someone who was subject to them." Let's return to Mayer's working definition of a miracle. Now, even an atheist or a skeptic can tick the first two on this list. But those who don't believe in God or in miracles cannot agree to the third. Their conclusion would be something like this: there is no rational or scientific explanation for what has just happened. But because I don't believe in God or in miracles, there must be an explanation. But for the time being, it's beyond the explanatory power of reason or science. Those who do believe in God and in miracles may conclude that God has intervened. More often than not, though, God heals us through the expertise of the medical profession. But we have to admit that some people are cured in ways that neither reason nor science can explain. By way of example, consider the case of Lourdes in France. Countless thousands of people have made a pilgrimage to Lourdes in the hope of being healed, and many people claim that they have been healed at Lourdes. But at Lourdes there is a medical bureau made up of doctors of different faiths and of no faith. Their task is to examine supposed miraculous cures and to ascertain whether there is any medical or scientific explanation for the cure that they have been asked to examine. Here's how they proceed. Firstly, they examine the patient's records to establish that a serious condition did exist. Secondly, they ascertain whether or not the cure occurred without any medical intervention. Then they establish whether or not the cure was instantaneous or of baffling rapidity, and that the condition hasn't reoccurred for a year afterwards. And finally, that there is no indication of fraud or psychological delusion. These are very specific and detailed requirements. So between 1948 and 1993, many people claim to have been cured at Lourdes, but only 18 of those cures have met the very strict criteria adopted by the International Medical Committee. The committee never uses the word miracle. It simply concludes that the cures are medically inexplicable. They have also concluded that many other alleged cures are unusual, but not beyond all possible scientific explanation. In the case of many alleged cures, there was not sufficient information prior to the healing to satisfy the stringent criteria demanded by the committee. In addition to this, many people who claim to have been cured at Lourdes have no wish to have their healing officially recognised as a miracle. Let me return to the idea of the miracle as sign. As we've already seen, the miracle in today's Gospel points to Jesus, who does what God does by healing the deaf. But I also think it points to the Lord, who seeks to heal our reluctance to listen, what we might call spiritual deafness. The Confessions of St. Augustine, written between 398 and 400 AD, is a kind of spiritual autobiography which tells the story of Augustine's own journey of faith. It's the story of a return to faith. Augustine likens his spiritual condition before his conversion to deafness. He writes this: "Late have I loved you, O beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you, for behold you were within me, and I outside. And I sought you outside. You were with me, and I was not with you. You called and cried to me, and broke open my deafness." Breaking open our deafness is essential for our spiritual journey, but it is also necessary if we are to become fully functioning human beings. Daniel Goleman emphasizes this in his book on emotional intelligence. Goleman's work examines the personal capabilities that drive outstanding performance and the degree to which they do so. He groups our capabilities into 3 categories. Category 1, purely technical skills, for example, accounting and business planning. Cognitive abilities make up the second category of capabilities. Cognitive abilities refer to a person's ability to reason analytically. The third category of capabilities has to do with emotional intelligence. Goleman's research concluded that emotional intelligence was twice as important as cognitive abilities or technical skills. What does he mean by emotional intelligence? He's referring to qualities like self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skill. At the heart of all these is the ability to listen to others. His research revealed that at the highest levels of a company, differences in technical skills are of negligible importance. What sets a star performer apart from an average performer at the highest levels of a company is their emotional intelligence. Goleman tells us that 90% of the difference in their profiles was attributable to emotional intelligence factors rather than cognitive abilities. In other words, a good leader is, among other things, a good listener. We're talking about a person who has empathy. In Primal Leadership, also written by Daniel Goleman, together with Richard Boyatis and Annie McKee, we read this: "Of all the emotional intelligence competencies, empathy matters most to visionary leadership. The ability to sense how others feel and to understand their perspectives means that a leader can articulate a truly inspirational vision. A leader who misreads people, on the other hand, simply can't inspire them." Here's an interesting observation made by the Australian social commentator Hugh Mackay in his book, Why Don't People Listen? He writes, "Our reluctance to listen is legendary, and there are many physical and psychological reasons why that is so. The first and most important reason why we so often fail to listen is that we don't have the courage to do it." Courage? Why does listening require courage? Listening is one of the most psychologically courageous things we ever do in our normal personal relationships, simply because listening, real listening, involves seriously entertaining the ideas of the other person. That entails the risk of having to change our minds in response to what we hear. Carl Rogers would agree. If you really understand another person, if you are willing to enter his private world and see how life appears to him without any attempt to make judgments, you run the risk of being changed yourself. This risk of being changed is one of the most frightening prospects most of us can face. It's for that reason that we develop avoidance strategies. Charlie Brown tells Linus, "You think my dad doesn't know anything about cars? Yesterday he heard a strange grinding noise coming from the engine." "Don't tell me. He stopped the car and fixed it." "No, he just turned the radio up louder so he couldn't hear it." Charlie Brown asks Lucy, "Do you think you're a different person from what you were last year? Do you think you've really changed? I remember last year you said you were going to try to be a better listener." "What?" Pope Francis stresses the importance of listening for the Synodal Church. He said this last September. It seems to me that the metaphor of the orchestra can well illuminate the synodal character of the Church. A symphony thrives on the skillful composition of the timbres of different instruments. Each one makes its contribution, sometimes alone, sometimes united with someone else, sometimes with the whole ensemble. Diversity is necessary. It is indispensable. However, each sound must contribute to the common design. This is why mutual listening is essential. Each musician must listen to the others. If one listens only to himself, however sublime his sound may be, it will not benefit the symphony. And the same would be the case if one section of the orchestra did not listen to the others, but played as if it were alone, as if it were the whole. In addition, the conductor of the orchestra is at the service of this kind of miracle that is each performance of a symphony. He has to listen more than anyone else, and at the same time, his job is to help each person and the whole orchestra develop the greatest creative fidelity. Fidelity to the work being performed, but also creative, able to give a soul to the score, to make it resonate in the here and now in a unique way. Dear brothers and sisters, it does us good to reflect upon ourselves as the image of the orchestra, in order to learn to be an ever more symphonic and synodal church. Mother Teresa was once interviewed by Dan Rather. He asked, "What do you say when you pray to God?" Mother Teresa replied, "I don't say anything. I just listen." "Well, what does God say to you?" "God doesn't say anything. He just listens." Listening or not listening is a constantly recurring theme in the cartoon Zits. Jeremy says to his father, "Of course I'm listening to whatever it is you said." Or to his mother, "Go on, I'm listening." But mother and son each accuse each other. "Your problem is that you always talk instead of listen." Pope Francis published his apostolic exhortation on love in the family in 216. It is also known by its Latin title Amoris Laetitia. In paragraphs 90 to 118, he offers some reflections on listening. Pope Francis says this: "Take time, quality time. This means being ready to listen patiently and attentively to everything the other person wants to say." He imagines a typical scenario. She thinks, "He does not listen to me. Even when he seems to, he is really doing something else." But at the same time, he is thinking, "I talk to her, and I feel like she can't wait for me to finish. When I speak to her, she tries to change the subject, or she gives me curt responses to end the conversation." Pope Francis says we all need the self-discipline of not speaking until the time is right. Instead of offering an opinion or advice, we need to be sure that we have heard everything the other person has to say. Often, the other spouse does not need a solution to his or her problems, but simply to be heard, to feel that someone has acknowledged their pain, their disappointment, their fear, their anger, their hopes, and their dreams. The deaf man in today's gospel represents all believers. Apart from the grace of God, we are all deaf to God's word. May the Lord truly open our ears that we can be attentive to his word. May he break open our deafness so that we can be truly attentive to those whom he has placed in our lives. Ephphatha, be opened.